He was just a black boy walking toward a bank with a folder clutched tightly in his hands, the kind of folder that carried dreams bigger than the city streets beneath his feet. Yet before he even touched the glass door, a baton slammed across his chest, and the world decided he did not belong. What unfolded on those steps was not a single act of cruelty, but a chain of humiliations that grew harsher with every breath, each one designed to strip away dignity until nothing remained. And still he stood. No one in the crowd knew who he really was. No one guessed why that battered folder mattered. And no one imagined that the truth hidden in those pages and the gleam of a small badge would one day turn the entire scene upside down. This is not just a story about humiliation, but about the kind of revelation that leaves even the most powerful speechless. If you want to know how far injustice can go before justice finally arrives, stay with me until the end. Give this video a like if you believe stories like this should be told. Subscribe so you never miss the next twist, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what you think might happen when the truth no longer stays hidden. Terrence Malloy walked with deliberate steps along the crowded avenue, clutching a folder that felt heavier with every block. The city around him roared with horns, chatter, and footsteps. Yet inside his chest, the sound of his own heartbeat was louder than all of it. His mother had entrusted him with the scholarship documents early that morning, reminding him with a tired but determined gaze that this could change everything. The glass facade of the towering bank ahead shimmered in the midday sun, standing like a fortress that both invited and excluded, its polished windows reflecting the sky as if mocking those who did not belong inside. Terrence smoothed the front of his press shirt, one his mother had labored over to erase every wrinkle, hoping appearances might shield him from the judgment of strangers. The boy's hand tightened on the folder as he climbed the granite steps, each one feeling like a test. The cool metal handle of the heavy glass door was within reach when Cliff Marston, the uniformed guard stationed at the entrance, stepped forward with sudden aggression. Without a word, he thrust his baton sideways, the metal rod pressing against Terrence's chest with a force that shocked him backward, the folder nearly slipping from his hand as he stumbled against the edge of the step. Pain prickled through his ribs, not from the pressure alone, but from the blunt realization that he was not welcome. The action was immediate, unprovoked, and final, the kind of silent judgment that carried the weight of an unspoken law. For a moment, the city noises dimmed. All Terrence could register was the cold sneer in Cliff's eyes, the silent command to stay back. The boy's lips parted as if to speak, but no words emerged. He had rehearsed polite sentences, explanations, even practiced the right tone to sound respectful, but the baton erased the need for words. His presence alone had been deemed too much, an offense requiring physical denial. The sting of rejection burned deeper than the shove. Behind him, polished shoes clicked against the steps as a middle-aged man in a tailored gray suit approached, silver hair gleaming in the light, his leather briefcase swinging casually at his side. The man exuded the air of someone born to access, one who never questioned whether doors would open for him. Cliff's transformation was instantaneous. The baton lowered as if it had never existed. His face softened into a courteous smile, and with swift deference, he pulled open the tall glass door. His back straightened. His voice carried the false warmth of practiced politeness, and the suited customer passed through without hesitation, unaware of the humiliation that had just unfolded inches away. The contrast was a knife slicing through Terrence's spirit. He remained frozen on the step, the folder trembling slightly in his grip, sweat beginning to form on his brow though the day was mild. The suited man disappeared into the cool interior, swallowed by the marble lobby and the polished counters where opportunity waited. Terrence was left outside, sunlight glaring against his skin, an invisible line drawn by Cliff's baton marking the boundary between belonging and exclusion. He could see inside through the glass, customers being guided to tellers, clerks flipping papers, managers shaking hands. It was a world of efficiency and order, a place where futures were signed into existence with the stroke of a pen. And yet he, standing with his documents of hope, was reduced to an obstacle on the steps. His chest tightened with shame, the sting of being displayed as unworthy in full public view. A pair of women passed on the sidewalk, casting him a brief glance before returning to their conversation, their laughter dismissing his presence as unimportant. A deliveryman wheeled a cart past, sparing him a fleeting look before focusing on his work. To them, it was background noise, another minor disturbance on the city stage. But to Terence, it was the beginning of a story written in humiliation. Cliff's baton remained at his side, ready to rise again if Terence dared to step forward. His eyes carried the same message as his earlier shove, a silent decree that this door was not meant for boys like him. Cliff Marston's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from detached dismissal to overt hostility, as though Terence's persistence was an offense in itself. The guard moved sharply, shoving his shoulder into the boy with brute force. The push sent Terence sprawling backwards down the steps, the weight of his body colliding with the unforgiving granite. His elbow scraped raw against the rough surface, and the folder burst open from his arms, scattering documents like leaves in the wind. He landed with a thud that jolted through his bones, shame and pain merging into one. The city's rhythm continued around him, yet for Terence the world had slowed to a cruel silence. He struggled to gather himself, reaching instinctively for the scattered pages, but before his fingers could close around the nearest sheet, a heavy boot came down. Cliff deliberately pressed his soul into the paper, grinding it against the concrete with disdain. The sharp crease of the boot's tread marked the once pristine application forms, smearing ink and folding edges that had been so carefully prepared. Terence's stomach twisted as he realized that the effort his mother had poured into preparing every detail was being desecrated in seconds. Cliff did not remove his foot, instead shifting his weight so that the sole dug harder into the pages, the act a silent proclamation of dominance. The humiliation burned hotter than the sun overhead. Around them, pedestrians began to notice, some slowing their steps to glance at the boy sprawled on the steps with his documents crushed beneath the guard's weight. Yet their eyes carried no urgency, no intent to intervene. A man in business attire glanced briefly before adjusting his tie and continuing toward the intersection. A young woman with headphones paused for a fraction of a second, curiosity flickering in her gaze, then shook her head and walked on. To them, it was an insignificant spectacle, the kind of imbalance they had grown numb to in the city's relentless churn. To Terence, it was everything. His throat tightened as he pulled himself onto his knees, the sting of scraped skin adding to the humiliation of being pressed down both physically and symbolically. The folder lay bent near his feet, one corner split, its integrity destroyed by the fall. He reached for another sheet that had blown a few feet away, fingers trembling not only from the physical effort, but from the gnawing fear that every page was being ruined beyond recovery. Each document had been carefully prepared, signatures aligned, references included, essays polished to perfection, and now they lay scattered on the ground like trash. Cliff remained towering above, his posture radiating authority, his silence more crushing than any insult could have been. The deliberate stomp of his boot was not the act of a man following orders, but of someone relishing the chance to impose his own hierarchy on another. He allowed the suited customer from earlier to pass freely into a world of comfort, while Terence was forced into the dirt outside. The contrast was sharp and searing, repeating itself again, this time with added brutality. The sound of the door closing behind the white customer seemed to slam shut the possibility of fairness as well. Terence gathered another page, smoothing it with shaking hands, smearing a faint streak of blood from his scraped palm across the margin. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, a mix of exhaustion, fear, and a spark of something harder, something defiant. He refused to release the folder entirely, no matter how broken it looked. He stacked the bent pages one over the other, pressing them against his chest, as though the mere act of holding them together might prevent his future from unraveling. Cliff removed his boot at last, not out of mercy, but because his point had been made. His eyes flicked to the glass doors of the bank once more, where inside he could see calm transactions and polite nods exchanged, an orderly world of respect and opportunity. Outside, he stood marked as an outcast. Cliff Marston was not content with having shoved and stomped. The guard's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of control, and when Terence shifted even slightly toward the door, Cliff's gloved hand clamped around his arm. Without effort, he yanked the boy sideways, dragging him down the steps toward the curb. The suddenness of the movement ripped the folder from Terence's hands again, the papers fluttering against his chest and spilling toward the ground like scattered feathers. His shoes scraped across the concrete, and his shoulder burned where Cliff's grip bit into his skin. Terence tried to steady himself, but the guard jerked him forward with deliberate force, pulling him to the edge of the sidewalk as though parading him before the city. The movement caught the attention of passers-by, and in moments a small crowd began to form. Commuters paused, their eyes drawn to the sight of a boy being handled like a trespasser, while the towering guard stood firm with authority. Cliff shoved Terence against the iron railing near the curb, positioning him there as if to display him like a captured offender. The humiliation intensified under the weight of eyes staring without compassion. The crowd that gathered was a mix of curiosity and indifference. Some shook their heads in casual dismissal, others smirked faintly as though the scene provided unwanted entertainment. Terence's cheeks burned as he clutched at his folder, now half empty, the pages lying crumpled at his feet. The edge of a paper clung stubbornly to the sidewalk, flapping in the breeze. But when he bent to retrieve it, Cliff pushed him back against the railing with a sharp arm, holding him in place. The onlookers muttered among themselves, some pointing toward the boy as if he were a spectacle. One man chuckled under his breath, raising his phone briefly before deciding the scene wasn't even worth capturing. A woman folded her arms and shook her head, her eyes narrowed not in sympathy but in irritation, as if Terence's mere presence delayed her day. Each gesture, each dismissive glance carved deeper into his spirit. The circle that formed around him was not one of solidarity, but of exclusion. A few individuals began imitating Cliff's dismissive motions, waving their hands at Terence as if shooing away a stray animal. Their gestures were sharp, their eyes empty of compassion, and each wave reinforced the invisible wall that separated him from belonging. The circle tightened, not physically but emotionally, pressing him into a smaller space where his dignity withered beneath the weight of scorn. Terence's breathing grew shallow as he struggled against the rising tide of humiliation. His body trembled, but his grip on the remaining folder stayed firm. He forced himself to look up, to meet the eyes that glared and mocked, yet most looked away immediately, unwilling to face their own complicity. Cliff stood tall, satisfied with his work, his baton tapping against his thigh in a rhythm of dominance. He had reduced the boy to a public example, a warning of what happened when someone deemed unworthy attempted to cross an invisible boundary. Terence's humiliation was no longer private. It had become a spectacle. The city's energy carried on around them, but within that small circle the air grew heavy with cruelty. A bus roared past, sending a gust of exhaust toward the sidewalk, and Terence coughed as the fumes enveloped him. His knees buckled for a moment, but he held his ground against the railing, clutching his bent documents tighter, as if they were a lifeline. His resolve flickered beneath the weight of shame, but it had not been extinguished. The circle of onlookers did not cheer Cliff on, but neither did they object. Their silence and mimicry served as fuel for the guard's authority. Terence's isolation grew more suffocating with each passing second. His chest heaved with effort, but his eyes burned with a quiet fire, an ember that would not die even under the crush of public scorn. Instead, they had silently agreed that he did not belong. As the circle of strangers broke apart and drifted back into the stream of the city, Terence finally spotted a cluster of papers near his feet. His essays, his forms, his carefully prepared application, all scattered and dirt-streaked, fragile symbols of a future slipping through his grasp. With trembling hands, he crouched to gather them, ignoring the sting of scraped knees against the concrete. Just as his fingers brushed the edge of one page, a shadow fell over him. Cliff's hand darted down faster, snatching the sheet away before Terence could secure it. The guard's lips curled into a cruel smirk, and without a word, he flicked his wrist, tossing the document high into the air. The page spun upward, catching the sunlight before fluttering chaotically in the wind, twisting and tumbling beyond Terence's reach. Terrence's breath caught in his throat as he watched the sheet drift across the busy street, its white surface marked with muddy boot prints from the earlier stomp. Before he could react, Cliff repeated the motion with another paper. One by one, he gathered pages from the boy's scattered folder and cast them into the air with deliberate malice. The wind carried them down the sidewalk, through the legs of passersby, across the hood of parked cars. Terrence lunged for them desperately, scrambling on his knees, reaching beneath a bench, stretching his arms toward the curb where one sheet threatened to blow into traffic. His fingers closed around the corner just before a passing car could grind it into blackened asphalt. He clutched it to his chest, his lungs gasping, sweat and dust mixing on his skin. Each page recovered came back crumpled and torn, a shell of what it had been, but he refused to let them go. Cliff's laughter was silent but clear in the tilt of his head, the casual way he continued to pluck up stray documents only to fling them higher, treating Terrence's desperation as amusement. By the time Terrence retrieved the last sheet, sweat was dripping into his eyes, his shirt clinging to his back, and his folder was so misshapen it barely held together. He pressed the stack against his chest, bent over as though shielding a fragile flame from a storm. Cliff, not yet finished, reached into a nearby storage crate and pulled out a collapsible barricade used to redirect foot traffic during construction. With a snap and clatter of metal joints, he spread it across the bank entrance, locking the latch with a satisfied motion. The bright orange bars of the barricade stood out against the pristine stone facade, glaring like a warning sign. Cliff positioned it so Terrence was forced behind its line, exiled from the doorway, as though branded a hazard. Pedestrians flowed around the barrier without question, entering the bank through an alternate side door that Cliff opened and held for them with feigned courtesy. Each passerby's ability to step inside with ease drove the knife of exclusion deeper. Terrence remained outside in the full blaze of the noon sun, the heat pressing down on his shoulders like a punishment. The sidewalk reflected the glare, making the air shimmer with suffocating intensity. Sweat ran down his temples, his shirt damp with effort, but he held firm with the crumpled papers clutched to his chest. His body ached, but he refused to collapse. He leaned against the barricade, his back straight despite the exhaustion, his eyes fixed once more on the gleaming glass doors beyond. Inside, he glimpsed customers seated comfortably, their voices calm as they handled their affairs, while he stood penned outside like a pariah. The barricade was not only physical but symbolic, a constructed line that declared to the world that he was not permitted entry. Cliff stood nearby with folded arms, his posture radiating victory, the baton tapping lightly against his thigh in idle rhythm. His eyes roamed the street with casual disinterest, as if guarding Terrence like a prisoner was a trivial task, barely worth attention. The seconds stretched into minutes, the minutes into what felt like hours, and Terrence's world narrowed to the scorching heat, the metal barrier before him, and the weight of his torn papers pressed against his chest. Each heartbeat carried a message of defiance. He would not run. He would not abandon what he came to do. The cruelty of Cliff's actions had stripped him of comfort, dignity, and ease, but it had not broken the core resolve that kept him rooted to the steps. He inhaled through his nose, forcing steadiness into his lungs, willing himself not to show the fatigue burning through his muscles. His eyes burned not only from sweat, but from the tears he refused to shed, for he knew that every tear shed here would be a victory for Cliff. Terrence's legs ached from standing, his arms from holding the disfigured papers to his chest, but his spirit refused to collapse. He was determined that his presence would not disappear into the sidewalk. Yet the guard was far from finished, for humiliation fed his arrogance. The revolving glass doors to the side opened, and a junior employee in a pressed blue uniform shirt appeared, wheeling a trash container filled to the brim with discarded paperwork, crumpled cups, and heavy bags of shredded documents. The young employee's eyes darted nervously as he approached the barricade, unsure of how to maneuver the load past the crowd of pedestrians. Cliff saw an opportunity. With a smirk carved into his weathered face, he seized the handle of the container and thrust it into Terrence's hands, forcing the boy backward with a sudden weight. Terrence staggered under the unexpected burden, his thin arms trembling as the weight of the container bore down on him. He clenched his jaw and dug his shoes against the pavement, trying to balance the load while Cliff watched with casual satisfaction, arms crossed, enjoying the spectacle of a boy reduced to carrying refuse outside the gates of opportunity. The container reeked of ink, sweat, and spoiled coffee, the odor filling Terrence's lungs as he struggled to maintain his grip. His scraped palms burned with fresh pain as the rough plastic edges cut deeper into his skin. The folder containing his documents was wedged between his arm and his chest, pressed hard to prevent it from falling, even as his muscles strained under the trash container's weight. Pedestrians glanced at him, some with mild curiosity, others with irritation at the minor blockage of the walkway. None offered help. Instead, they stepped around him, murmuring about the inconvenience of having to dodge his struggle. The heat of the sun bore down harder, reflecting off the concrete, adding a cruel layer of fatigue to his already battered body. His breathing quickened, shallow gasps forced through gritted teeth as his shoulders threatened to give out. Yet he held on, refusing to let the container slip, because letting it fall would mean granting Cliff a fresh victory. Cliff eventually nodded toward the ground, signaling that Terrence could put it down. With a grunt of relief, Terrence bent at the knees and lowered the container carefully to avoid spilling its contents across the sidewalk. His muscles quivered and sweat soaked through his back. He steadied himself with one hand against the pavement, his knees barely able to hold his own weight. Just as he drew in a shaky breath of relief, Cliff moved again with calculated cruelty. With a subtle sidestep, the guard extended his polished boot and hooked it around Terrence's ankle as the boy tried to straighten. Terrence's balance collapsed instantly. His body pitched forward, his palms striking the rough sidewalk with sharp force, tearing open the scabs from his earlier fall. Warm blood smeared against the concrete as pain shot through his hands, a raw sting that blurred his vision. The folder slipped from his grip once more, skidding across the ground until it came to rest against the barricade's base. Terrence lay sprawled on the pavement, his chest pressed against the hot stone, his face inches from the dirt and dust of the city's underbelly. The sound of footsteps continued around him, uncaring, indifferent. A businessman passing by stepped over his legs with hardly a pause. A woman in a floral dress glanced down briefly, then turned her face away and continued her path. The city had absorbed the cruelty into its rhythm, treating his fall as an inconvenience rather than an outrage. The smell of the garbage container still lingered beside him, adding to the degradation, as if he were meant to be discarded along with its contents. Terrence's chest tightened not only from the physical blow, but from the crushing weight of invisibility. He pushed himself upward, his arms shaking, blood streaking down his wrists, leaving dark stains on the creases of his shirt. He crawled toward the folder again, fingers trembling as he pulled it back into his grip. Each page inside was more bent, more torn, more stained, yet he held it as tightly as he would a lifeline, unwilling to let even a single sheet slip away. Cliff towered above him, his expression unreadable, his baton still resting in his hand. The tripping motion had been casual, executed with the precision of someone who had done such things before and enjoyed the quiet power it gave him. He had forced himself back to his feet in the face of humiliation, and though the crowd had turned away, the humiliation lingered in every passing glance that failed to see him as more than an obstacle. Cliff Marston's satisfaction only grew from the boy's persistence. The more Terrence resisted surrender, the more Cliff's arrogance demanded new ways to crush his spirit. The barricade was still in place, marking Terrence's exclusion with bright orange bars. But now Cliff gripped his arm again and shoved him sideways toward the edge of the building where the driveway cut into the sidewalk. The sudden force pushed Terrence into the narrow strip where cars rolled in and out of the bank's private parking garage. The space was choked with dust and exhaust fumes, the smell of burning gasoline heavy in the air, and every vehicle that passed sent a blast of choking smoke into Terrence's face. He coughed hard, his lungs burning, his eyes watering from the sting of exhaust, but Cliff stood firmly behind him, preventing him from moving back toward the sidewalk. The guard positioned him there deliberately, as if the boy belonged only among fumes and filth, a living boundary marker warning others not to cross. Terrence pressed the folder against his chest, his vision blurred by tears forced from his eyes by the fumes. his body swaying slightly as each passing car rattled the pavement beneath his shoes. A black sedan rolled past with its window down, and the driver glanced at the boy with mild irritation before accelerating away. Dust and heat blew into Terrence's face, plastering his hair to his forehead and coating his tongue with bitterness. Cliff's expression betrayed nothing but smug amusement. He adjusted his belt and leaned casually against the barricade, watching Terrence endure the barrage of choking smoke as though it were a well-deserved punishment. Each car became another weapon, another blow against the boy's dignity. Terrence's chest heaved with every ragged breath, but his legs locked into place. He would not give Cliff the satisfaction of watching him collapse in the dirt. He coughed again, his throat raw. Yet through the haze of exhaust, he lifted his head and stared toward the bank's shining glass doors. His eyes burned not only from fumes, but from an anger coiled deep within his chest, an anger sharpened by helplessness, but restrained by willpower. Cliff's arrogance climbed to new heights. Pulling a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket, he flipped it open with exaggerated care, as though preparing to record something of great consequence. With a flourish of his pen, he began writing across the page while glancing at Terrence from the corner of his eye. Each stroke of ink was purposeful, heavy, meant to be seen. He tilted the notebook slightly so the boy could catch the faint scrawl of words that branded him not as a student or applicant, but as a violator. Terrence could not make out the exact phrases, but he saw his name etched into the page, surrounded by lines that implied accusations, violations, crimes that were not his. Cliff wrote slowly, relishing every letter, pausing occasionally to tap the pen against the page as if considering what further charges to invent. He looked up briefly to meet Terrence's eyes, a sneer tugging at his lips, and then bent his head again to write more. The sound of the pen scratching against paper cut sharper than the roar of engines around them. It was the sound of being condemned without a voice, without a trial, without the chance to defend himself. Terrence's jaw clenched. He wanted to cry out, to demand the notebook be torn to shreds, to demand recognition of the truth written in his battered folder instead of lies written in that book. But he remained silent, holding his ground in the haze of fumes, knowing that any outburst would only feed Cliff's arrogance further. A delivery van rolled past, its exhaust cloud engulfing him completely for a moment, leaving him choking and bent over, the folder pressed desperately against his chest to keep from falling. His knees wavered, but he steadied himself, rising again into the stream of dust and smoke, blood still streaking across his hands. The humiliation carved deeper into his memory, another scar layered upon the ones already inflicted. Cliff closed the notebook with a snap and slid the pen back into his pocket, tucking the record of fabricated guilt away as though it were official. He tucked the notebook beneath his arm, the gesture final and dismissive, a sign that the boy's fate had been sealed in writing. Terrence's vision blurred again, but not from fumes this time. His eyes brimmed with unspilled tears, his throat ached from silent endurance, and his heart hammered with the unbearable knowledge that he had been labeled something less than human. Yet, in that very moment, something within him solidified. The folder pressed to his chest was no longer just a stack of papers. His thin arms still clutched the bent folder against his chest, protecting it like armor even though the once pristine documents inside were stained with grime, smeared with blood, and marked by shoe prints. Every humiliation felt like a weight meant to force him to abandon his place on the steps, but the longer he endured, the more his determination grew into something that even Cliff's sneer could not erase. The guard remained nearby with arms folded, notebook tucked away, and baton still at his side, as though satisfied that he had already destroyed the boy's chances at dignity. He leaned lazily against the barricade, his expression smug, while Terrence's legs trembled from fatigue. Yet fate had a way of bending cruelty toward revelation. A sudden gust of wind swept down the avenue, catching the loose edge of a paper inside Terrence's broken folder. Before he could tighten his grip, the wind tugged harder, pulling several sheets free and sending them scattering across the sidewalk once more. Terrence lurched forward instinctively, his bloodied hands stretching after the fluttering pages, his knees scraping fresh against the rough pavement. His folder tipped open wide as he reached, spilling more contents across the ground. Among the papers was a small object he had nearly forgotten was there, something his mother had tucked in the folder with gentle hands that morning. It was a polished badge no larger than his palm, embossed with the insignia of the bank itself. The metal glinted sharply in the sunlight as it slid across the ground and came to rest near the base of the barricade. Terence froze as his eyes caught the gleam, his breath caught in his chest. He had not intended to reveal it. The badge was a token reserved for select participants in the bank's elite youth program, given only to children of major clients or strategic partners. It was proof of belonging at the highest level, though Terence himself had never wanted to wield it as a shield. He reached for it quickly, desperate to return it to the folder before Cliff noticed. But someone else's eyes had already landed on it. Loretta Gaines, a longtime employee of the bank, had stepped outside with a stack of files cradled in her arms. She was in her late 50s, her posture weary from years of service, her uniform crisp but faded from countless washes. She knew the rhythms of the institution better than most, having worked under multiple directors, watching the bank grow from modest beginnings to a polished powerhouse. Her gaze, sharpened by experience, swept over the boy kneeling on the ground, the guard's looming figure, and then landed on the badge, catching the light near the barricade. She stopped mid-step, her breath hitching softly as recognition struck. The insignia etched into the badge was unmistakable, reserved only for the bank's most treasured youth initiative, a program that groomed the children of its wealthiest investors and key partners for future leadership. She had seen such badges only a handful of times in her career, pinned carefully onto blazers during formal ceremonies, guarded like heirlooms by families who valued their symbolic weight. To see one glinting on the dirty pavement beside a battered folder clutched by a bleeding boy outside the bank's doors jarred her. Loretta's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, trying to reconcile the cruel scene with what she knew to be true. Terence snatched the badge quickly, tucking it back into the folder, his cheeks burning with shame at having exposed it. But Loretta had already seen enough. Her mind reeled with questions. Who was this boy? Why was he here, brutalized by a guard as though he were a trespasser? She had served long enough to recognize the last name embossed faintly on the back of the badge, though she had not heard it spoken in years. The name Malloy was tied to one of the bank's most strategic clients, a family whose investments had sustained expansion projects and guaranteed stability during turbulent economic times. Their support was part of why her job still existed. The idea that Cliff Marston, blinded by arrogance, had reduced the son of that family to a public spectacle filled her with a cold fury. Cliff, oblivious to her realization, continued leaning against the barricade, his smirk intact, unconcerned with the badge that had nearly changed everything in an instant. Loretta's heart pounded, her instinct urging her to step in immediately, but years of service had taught her patience. She knew the hierarchy of the institution and the weight of timing. Her hands gripped the files tighter as she glanced around, noting the passers-by who still moved indifferently past the scene, unaware of the quiet storm that had just shifted direction. Terence rose slowly from the ground, clutching his folder tighter than ever, his knuckles white against the bent edges. Terence himself stood swaying in the heat, his skin streaked with sweat and dust, his hands bloodied from the repeated falls, his folder crumpled against his chest like a shield. He kept his head high despite the humiliation that had built stage by stage, his eyes fixed on the glass facade of the bank, determined not to abandon his ground no matter the cruelty he faced. The moment of revelation arrived not with Loretta's words, but with the timing of fate itself. The polished glass doors swung open with a hydraulic sigh, and the sound cut through the heat and haze like the prelude to a storm. Edmund Sloan, the regional director of the bank, strode into the sunlight flanked by a delegation of foreign guests, their suits immaculate, their expressions curious as they absorbed the grandeur of the building. Edmund himself was a man in his late 50s, tall and silver-haired, his presence commanding without effort, his tailored jacket reflecting his authority. He had spent decades shaping the bank's reputation, securing investments, and forging international partnerships. He was a figure rarely seen outside the executive floors, and his appearance at the entrance was enough to make passing employees straighten their spines. His steps slowed as his gaze landed on the scene before him. A boy hemmed in by a barricade, his clothes torn and stained, his folder bent nearly in half, and a guard standing smugly at his side as if displaying a victory. Edmund's brow furrowed instantly, his stride breaking as confusion hardened into anger. The delegation behind him noticed as well, their whispers rising in accented tones, their eyes drawn to the incongruous sight of a bloodied boy standing in the sun, while others walked freely past him into the air-conditioned interior. The air itself seemed to thicken as Edmund's presence altered the atmosphere. Cliff straightened his posture abruptly, recognition of his superior sparking panic in his eyes. But he clung to arrogance still, offering no explanation, merely folding his arms as if the boy at his side were a justified problem. Terence felt the weight of the new eyes upon him, his heart pounding as the figure of authority approached. He gripped the folder tighter, his knuckles white, unwilling to let go of the proof of his purpose, even as shame threatened to overwhelm him. He did not speak, but his silence held a power born from suffering endured without surrender. Then fate intervened a second time. One of the foreign guests, a tall man in a navy suit with sharp eyes, halted mid-step as his gaze caught the gleam of something near Terence's feet. The badge, which had slipped free once more from the battered folder during the gust of wind, lay half-hidden by a fold of paper against the barricade. The man bent slightly, curiosity pulling him closer, and with a gesture of inquiry pointed toward it, drawing Edmund's attention to the object. The director's eyes followed, narrowing as he recognized the emblem even before he stooped to pick it up. His hand closed over the badge, lifting it into the light, where the insignia glimmered unmistakably against the sun. His breath caught for the briefest of moments as memory collided with recognition. He turned the badge over in his palm, and the faintly embossed name on its back, Malloy, burned into his vision. Edmund's face shifted, his authority transforming into urgency, his silver brows knitting together as he connected the boy before him with one of the bank's most strategic and powerful clients. The Malloy family was not merely an investor. They were a pillar of the bank's survival in years past, a family whose continued support ensured international stability and growth. To see their heir standing bloodied, humiliated, and barred from entry outside his own bank was a disaster beyond comprehension. The delegation noticed his reaction and grew silent, sensing the gravity of what Edmund now held in his hand. Cliff paled as Edmund's gaze snapped toward him, the badge gleaming like an indictment. The arrogance that had guided every shove, every stomp, every false report collapsed in the face of authority that could not be deceived. Loretta stepped closer, her voice unneeded, for Edmund's expression spoke volumes. Terence remained still, his body swaying from exhaustion, yet his eyes locked onto the director's, searching for recognition, for justice, for the dignity that had been stripped from him. Edmund stepped forward and placed the badge into Terence's battered hands, closing the boy's fingers around it as though sealing the truth for all to witness. The gesture itself was monumental, a reversal of everything Cliff had done, and in that moment the balance of power shifted irrevocably. His chest rose and fell heavily, yet his eyes locked onto Edmund's with the quiet intensity of a boy who had endured humiliation without surrender. Edmund's face hardened into a mask of steel authority, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward Cliff Marston. The guard, moments before smug and untouchable, now looked stricken, his arrogance draining away under the weight of his superior's scrutiny. The notebook that had falsely branded Terence as a violator still bulged from Cliff's pocket, its fabricated accusations now meaningless in the face of the truth Edmund held. With a sharp motion, Edmund gestured for nearby staff to gather, his voice carrying over the hum of the city with a controlled thunder of command. Employees emerged from inside the bank, clerks and tellers pausing mid-task to step into the sunlight, their eyes widening as they recognized the boy who had been barred outside and the director who now stood before him. Customers hesitated at the threshold, drawn into the moment by the authority in Edmund's stance, their chatter dying into silence. Loretta Gaines stood near the edge of the gathering, her heart pounding as relief mingled with vindication. She had seen the badge first, but it was Edmund's authority, that gave the revelation its force. Cliff shifted on his feet, his baton hanging limply by his side, his posture shrinking under the weight of the audience forming around him. Edmund's voice cut through the silence, each word measured and heavy, recounting the injustice laid bare before their eyes. He described the sight of a child confined behind a barricade, choked by exhaust fumes, paraded like an offender, his documents stomped and scattered, his dignity stripped piece by piece. Each word was an indictment, not only against Cliff, but against the silence of those who had watched without protest. The gathered staff shifted uneasily, some lowering their eyes, others nodding in shame as the truth pressed upon them. Customers exchanged guilty glances, their earlier indifference now exposed under the director's unflinching gaze. Edmund did not raise his voice, yet the weight of his words left no room for denial. Cliff attempted to speak, his mouth opening in a stammer of defense, but Edmund's raised hand silenced him instantly. The director's eyes burned with righteous fury, the kind of fury born not from personal offense, but from betrayal of values. He stepped closer to Cliff, towering over him with authority that could not be challenged, and with a final command stripped the guard of his position on the spot. The order was absolute, unshakable, delivered in front of witnesses so that no one could twist or dilute its meaning. Staff members moved quickly at the signal, stepping toward Cliff with firm hands that seized his arms, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were carrying out justice. Cliff struggled briefly, his body jerking in disbelief, but his strength faltered against the certainty of his fate. His eyes darted desperately to the crowd for sympathy, for support, but found only disapproval. Where once bystanders had imitated his gestures and mimicked his dismissal of Terence, now they whispered in shame, their complicity exposed by the light of truth. The guard's pale face revealed the collapse of arrogance, his jaw tight as he was dragged away from the barricade he had erected, the baton slipping from his fingers to clatter against the pavement with a hollow echo. Terence watched in silence, his chest heaving, his grip on the badge tightening until his knuckles blanched. The sight of Cliff being pulled away did not erase the wounds carved into his skin or spirit, but it marked the first step toward justice, a recognition that the cruelty he had endured was no longer invisible. The delegation of foreign guests looked on with solemn nods, their murmurs carrying disapproval of the injustice they had witnessed, their presence ensuring that the scandal would not remain hidden. Loretta's lips pressed together as her eyes softened toward the boy, silently affirming that his endurance had brought about the fall of arrogance. The staff who had turned away earlier now avoided each other's eyes, guilt twisting their faces as they realized their silence had aided Cliff's cruelty. A few whispered apologies that never reached Terence's ears, their words too soft to matter, their actions too late to heal what had been done. Customers shifted uneasily, some clearing their throats, others murmuring criticism of the guard now that it was safe to do so. Their whispers filled the space with the hollow sound of regret, but none could erase the truth that they had been willing spectators until power forced them to acknowledge the wrong. Cliff's body sagged as he was dragged down the steps, his pale face slick with sweat, his arrogance stripped bare. No longer the towering figure with baton and authority, he was reduced to a disgraced man shuffling under the grip of others, his silence now evidence of defeat. The barricade he had placed to confine Terence still stood at the bank's entrance, bright orange against the gray stone, but now it seemed ridiculous, a flimsy prop symbolizing a cruelty that had collapsed under truth. Edmund's sharp command summoned 2 employees to remove it, and with a clang of metal joints the barrier was folded and carried away, restoring the threshold to its rightful openness. The heavy silence that lingered after Cliff Marston was dragged away clung to the air like a reminder of everything that had transpired. And though the crowd still whispered in uneasy tones, the focus shifted from the disgraced guard to the boy who had endured so much without yielding. Terence Malloy stood with his bloodied hands clutching the bent folder and the gleaming badge, his body trembling from exhaustion, yet upright with a dignity no cruelty could erase. The regional director, Edmund Sloan, allowed the shame of the scene to weigh visibly on his face for a long moment before turning back toward the boy. Without hesitation, he bent down, something no one had expected from a man of his rank. and began gathering the scattered documents from the ground. He lifted the smudged, bent pages with deliberate care, smoothing the creases against his palm, and one by one returned them to Terrence's folder as though each paper was an acknowledgement of worth and a correction of the injustice that had desecrated them. When the last page was placed back into Terrence's shaking hands, Edmund straightened to his full height, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes steady with resolve. With one arm, he gestured toward the glass doors that had been barred against the boy for so long, and with his other hand, he rested lightly against Terrence's back, guiding him forward through the entrance in full view of everyone who had once looked away. The sound of their steps on the polished marble echoed in the vast lobby, a sound that declared belonging. Staff stood silently at their stations, their faces shifting with shame as they watched the director walk side by side with the boy they had once ignored outside. Customers sitting in comfortable chairs lowered their eyes, unable to meet Terrence's gaze, while a few foreign guests from the delegation followed quietly behind, their presence a guarantee that what had happened would not be buried. Terrence felt the cool air wash over his bruised skin as they stepped inside, a sharp contrast to the heat and exhaust that had assaulted him outside. The lobby, once a symbol of exclusion, now stretched before him as a space reclaimed. He pressed the folder tighter against his chest, not in fear of losing it again, but as a reminder that it had survived alongside him. Edmund guided him toward a desk near the center of the hall and had him sit, his voice low but firm as he ordered staff to bring water and medical supplies. The boy's hands were quickly cleaned and wrapped in fresh bandages, and though the sting remained, Terrence felt the deeper wound inside him begin to mend. Loretta Gaines appeared from the side, her eyes still sharp with the recognition she had carried earlier, and she gave him a nod that held the weight of quiet solidarity. Edmund remained nearby, his presence a shield, while customers and employees alike whispered in hushed tones about what had unfolded. That evening, the story did not remain confined to the bank's lobby. News spread through the city as foreign guests recounted the incident to their colleagues, as employees repeated it with a mixture of shame and awe, and as witnesses who had filmed fragments on their phones began to share them. By morning, the bank's reputation trembled under scrutiny, and Edmund, knowing the institution could not hide from the truth, called a press conference. Cameras crowded the polished lobby, where Terrence had been humiliated only the day before, and lights shone on the same marble floor that had once seemed unreachable. Edmund stood at the podium, his voice steady, recounting the events in full without softening their cruelty. He named the injustice, described the suffering inflicted on a boy who carried the insignia of their own elite program, and acknowledged the silence of those who had stood by. He did not shift blame to a single guard, though Cliff Marston's name was spoken with finality as a man permanently barred from security service. Instead, he pointed to the institution's responsibility, declaring that no child, no customer, no human being should be treated with such disdain on their doorstep. He announced sweeping reforms, new measures to prevent discrimination at every level, mandatory training for all employees, and a direct line for grievances to be addressed without fear of dismissal. His words were not polished promises for the sake of reputation, but sharp declarations meant to ensure the cruelty never repeated. Terrence sat quietly off to the side during the press conference, his hands still bandaged, his folder now restored with every paper pressed flat once again. The badge gleamed faintly against the edge of the table where he had set it, its insignia no longer just a symbol of privilege, but now a testament to endurance. Cameras captured his face, and though he did not speak, his presence carried the weight of truth stronger than words. Across the city and beyond, people watched the broadcast, some ashamed of their own silence in the face of injustice, others inspired by the sight of a boy who had endured without surrender, and a leader who had chosen to correct rather than conceal. Cliff Marston faded quickly into obscurity. His arrogance turned into infamy, a cautionary tale of how cruelty built on prejudice leads not to power, but to disgrace. The bystanders who had once mimicked his gestures now whispered apologies into the void, their complicity forever a reminder that silence is itself a choice. Terrence's name, however, carried forward not only through the badge, but through the story of what had been endured and revealed. He walked from a press conference with his head higher, his steps steadier, the weight of humiliation transformed into the strength of survival. He understood that the scars on his skin would heal, but the scar of the experience would remain, shaping him into someone who knew firsthand the cost of injustice and the power of resilience. The message left behind was undeniable. Cruelty may parade itself in arrogance, but dignity, once recognized and defended, has the power to silence even the loudest oppressor. Justice delivered in public view does not erase suffering, but it plants the seed of change so that others may not endure the same. And as Terrence Malloy carried his folder out of the bank that day, the sun no longer burned as punishment, but shone as a witness to the truth that had finally been acknowledged. The end. If you've stayed with the story until the very end, I'd like to ask you something. Did the way Terrence endured humiliation and finally had his identity revealed strike you as powerful? Or did you see the ending coming? I want to hear how you felt about the twists, about the people who stood by in silence, and about the justice that was finally delivered. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching this from, because stories like this connect us across every place and every background. And if this story made you think, if it moved you, or even made you angry at the unfairness, support the channel by subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Give this video a like if you believe stories about dignity and justice should be told more often, and share it so more people can join the conversation.